everybody to this plenary session entitled Looking Forward from Critical Transitional Justice to New Justice Imaginaries. I see people are still coming in, so we'll take it a bit slowly. And welcome to the two speakers who probably need no introduction, but nevertheless, let me welcome Professor Laurel Fletcher, Chancellor's Clinical Professor of Law at UC Berkeley Law School, where she co-directs the International Human Rights Law Clinic and the Miller Institute for Global Challenges and the Law. As director of the International Human Rights Law Clinic, Professor Fletcher has advocated on behalf of victims before international courts and tribunals, and has issued numerous human rights reports on topics ranging from sexual violence in armed conflicts to human rights violations of tip workers in the US restaurant industry. She has published extensively on transitional justice, and her recent publications include Power and the International Human Rights Imaginary, a critique of practice. Welcome, Laurel. And Professor Tine Destrooper, Director of the Justice Visions Program and Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law and Criminology of Ghent University. Professor Destrooper's research focuses on victim participation in transitional justice. She currently carries out a cross-case analysis of the long-term and unforeseen effects of victim participation on victims and their communities. She is also the coordinator of a cross-institutional project on future-proofing human rights accountability, and she is engaged in various case studies regarding transitional justice in a paradigmatic context. Welcome, Tine. My name is Giselle Corradi. I am the coordinator of the Human Rights Research Network of Ghent University, and it is my pleasure to moderate this session. We will have a conversation with our two speakers of about 35 minutes to 40 minutes, and afterwards we will have plenty of time for Q&A with the audience. So, let's start. We have been having many conversations in the past days, and especially yesterday, many challenges in the field of transitional justice emerged based on the latest findings, amongst others, challenges regarding the methods that we use, challenges regarding how to reach different epistemic frameworks, how to engage with vulnerable groups, and that has provided us a very good solid ground to start looking deeper at the root causes of these challenges, what kind of paradigms can help us in thinking further about them, but also how to look to the future, how to look for solutions or ways to overcome these challenges. And in that respect, there are some intersections between the work you have been doing, Laurel, on human rights imaginaries, and the work that you have been doing, Tine, on victim participation, how the need to revisit ideas about transitional justice and human rights imaginaries can perhaps provide entry points in looking both at the root causes and the solutions. So perhaps let us start, Tine, with looking at the challenges that we have been encountering and their root causes.
Thank you so much, Giselle, and also for framing the last 2 days so nicely. That was a very nice synopsis and a lot of rich discussions. And I think if you invite us to start talking about challenges, there are enough of them that we could point to, right? So I'll try to maybe systematize the answer a bit. And to me, what was interesting in listening to the conversations in these past 2 days is the extent to which we're both talking about practical challenges with the actual practice of TJ, and we're also talking about challenges with doing TJ research, and then we're obviously talking about how those two intersect. And those three levels, I think, are somewhat different, but of course they're very, very much related. And so when it comes to, for example, the practice of TJ, what struck me in these conversations in the past 2 days is that on the one hand, there are so many ways in which globally TJ processes have been derailed, have been stalling. There's a lot of examples of that happening. And I think at the basis of some of these the stalling of DJ processes. There's a number of material or political factors. We look at the Tunisian DJ process, for example, the lack of there being money in the reparation fund. We look at, for example, the Philippines and the role of money in just avoiding that any kind of DJ process happens. We're looking at, a number of cases in Chile, for example, effective transitions, and Kat Collins was here online yesterday talking about, she wrote about post-TJ and what the initial TJ process does in terms of making it possible that certain issues do or do not enter the realm of justice. But I think that notion of post-TJ, for example, also points us towards certain dynamics of erasure, which I think are very important and which we've also talked about quite a bit in the session yesterday morning, for example. And when we talk about erasure, what struck me is that on the one hand, we're talking about a kind of erasure that seems to be unavoidable and happening in any sort of TJ process, from the very start, also in paradigmatic cases of TJ. But we're also talking about the extent to which certain new topics difficultly make it into the TJ discourse. And so that has been quite interesting for me to think more about that in these basically past 24 hours, I guess, or 36 hours since we've been here together. Because what's striking to me is that in response to a lot of this erasure that is happening, this challenge of erasure, we see that people are doing a lot of innovative work, that they're really trying to experiment with this discourse and this toolkit of TJ. And what's been striking to me is that when they do, on the one hand, it's very much a direct response to a direct cause being erased from the practice of TJ or being invisible in the practice of TJ. But as they're developing kind of new strategies, new ways of doing TJ, and then I'm really speaking from anything from, we have a lot of panels on the arts, for example, artistic practices as new ways of doing TJ, but also things like investigative commons, like, forensic architecture, which allows us to look at a much broader range of issues in a much more fine-grained way. A lot of what these practices are doing is not just addressing the initial or factual erasure that's happening in a specific struggle, but in doing so, I think they're also allowing for new issues and for new ways of doing TJ to enter the conversation. And that to me has been very interesting. I'm thinking, Laurel, of a talk that you gave at NYU a couple of months ago, and Pablo de Brave, who is also a member of our advisory board for this project, he was there. And I think he said something like, human rights is fantastic because they give us this vision of what an ideal future looks like, but they're really lousy at telling us how to get there. And that kind of stuck with me, and it stuck with me because I think that's the appeal of TJ, is that it gives us this idea that if you do that and that and that, you're actually going to get there. It's kind of the more operational dimension of human rights, if you will. And so there, I think it's really interesting to think more about how do we maybe acknowledge TJ for that which it is, which is a very operational way of doing things. It's insufficient at present, but how do we look at the practice and what is happening in practice to overcome some of these challenges, for us to think about TJ in a new way. And that actually, I think, also goes to the level which I mentioned of research and challenges in research is how do we capture all of that, right? Because a lot of these new practices, some people are calling what they do TJ, and sometimes these practices are things where we would think, is it? And sometimes people are doing stuff that, looks like TJ, feels like TJ, but they're not using that label, or they're resisting that label. And so also that difficulty for research to capture and to distill in a way, maybe what is the essence of TJ? So that's a broader question, and a very concrete example, and then I'll stop. It is for me in the Belgian context, for example, we have had this parliamentary commission on Belgium's colonial past, which in the public domain very quickly got called a truth commission, where you could ask, how far is it aligned with the normative objectives of TJ? Maybe not so much. And then at the same time, around the time that commission happened, we had a collective, a women's collective from the Diaspora Banco, which organized the Assises des Coloniales, which very much felt like a DJ thing. It felt like a much better, much more, kind of grounded version of truth-seeking, truth-telling, truth-hearing, truth-listening. They organized this as a 10-year process, etc. But they very much resisted this label of DJ. So how do we capture that? What do we call DJ? What do we recognize as such? And so these are some of the very difficult challenges for research and the link between practice and research for me. And sorry, I went on for very long.
Very interesting, Tina. Thank you very much. And Laurel, does this resonate with the way you have been looking at human rights and human rights institutions and the way they are being challenged?
I mean, I think I was really excited. First of all, thank you all for waking up and coming after the late night last night. I don't know, I'm still kind of thinking about the wonderful concert and the dulcet sounds and sort of kind of coming back and entering into from the art space to the headspace. So thank you, Tina, for bringing this back, and Giselle for framing these questions. I mean, I think I want to pick up on the theme of erasure, because I've been looking more recently at kind of pulled back the frame, not looking so much at the field of TJ, but looking more broadly at the field of human rights. And I come from a generation where TJ is a subset of the human rights field, and I think probably now that we can debate that. There's some people maybe in this room who think like, that's crazy. I mean, they're related, sure, but a distant cousin perhaps. So in terms of erasure, I think that the human rights field itself has been consumed for the last decade with questions of whether or not we are engaging in auto-erasure or self-erasure, although we haven't used that vocabulary. And by that I mean there's been, now I would say there's a widespread consensus that the traditional human rights paradigm and theories of change are no longer fit for purpose, is the phrase that gets used over and over again. And what is meant by that is that the traditional way of doing human rights, and we can unpack what human rights means, but if you understand human rights in a particular way, that documenting human rights abuses, bringing attention, pressuring states, shaming states will then change behavior. The world doesn't work that way anymore. And yet we keep, well, there's two schools of thought. One is, well, we just need to do that more and better and louder and with more money and in more places, and and that'll get us there. And then the second school of thought is, no. We need new theories of change. We need new ways of doing things. We need to find a new, maybe even a new purpose, and certainly a new fit. And there probably isn't going to be just one way to do that. And the reasons for why we are finding ourselves no longer fit for purpose are some of the things that are plaguing the transitional justice field. So we have a rise of multipolarity. It is, although maybe we're swinging back to something more akin to the Cold War, I think foreign affairs is murky at this moment. But certainly, we're not going to go back to where we were in 1945 or 1955. So we have multipolarity, makes the world more complicated. The rise of big tech and private industry, not just business and human rights, but in particular tech, both the promise of tech and the way that tech has made, in some ways flattened and democratized social mobilization and human rights work, but at the same time poses unprecedented threats to rights and to rights enjoyment, and that our very ability to understand and regulate outpaces the speed at which technology is changing. And so that is just an unprecedented set of challenges. And rising authoritarianism. Right? The whole premise of our paradigm is that there are democratic hegemons who will be human rights champions, not always reliably, but can be appealed to for support and are capable of being shamed. Authoritarians, when you have a whole cohort of authoritarians cheering each other on, can't be shamed, or can't be shamed in the same way. So those levers don't work anymore. And I think that these sets of challenges can be thought of as analogous to what Tina's and her colleagues are looking at paradigmatic cases of transitional justice, right? And so we've seen the paradigm being used in ongoing conflict, installed TJ processes. I mean, TJ started because there were transitions to democracies. You had the buy-in of the state. And so that set in motion and made possible this thing that we call TJ. Well, that is not the case in so many contexts, and yet we're using the paradigm. So what do we do? So like transitional justice, and what Tina was talking about, new practice forms, I think that we're seeing in the human rights field more generally new social movements that are arising and new social formations that are pushing human rights in a transnational context and with a transnational consciousness. And so climate justice, I think it is one. You have a whole new generation of activists that came up largely, outside of what we would consider traditional human rights networks, and this is a rights-based agenda. Very new tools, very different paradigm. I would say digital rights. And there it's probably a little bit more complicated. You have some overlapping Venn diagrams, but I would say much more strongly in technology, social justice tech people coming into human rights spaces, and traditional human rights people need understanding that we have to figure out what we do about tech. But very different, I think, sociological basis for movement actors. And then I would just use the Black Lives Matter as a human rights movement that emerged from racial social justice communities. Again, very different tradition, very different understanding and priorities about rights, and obviously the role of race and anti-racism in that work. And those are changing the ecosystem within which all of us are working. And so where's the traditional paradigm? I'm going to use a shorthand and say, okay, so Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and I have dear colleagues there, respect them greatly. They are behemoths of an earlier era. And while they are evolving, they're evolving slowly, and I think they're really at risk of finding themselves outpaced by these challenges and by the movements that are rising to address them. At the same time, I do not subscribe to some of the most pessimistic assessments of the human rights movement that were rose up about 10 years ago from Sam Moyne and Stephen Hopgood about the end times. We've had a decade of end times and we're still alive and kicking. So I think that, like Mark Twain said, the stories of my death have been, are premature. I think that could also be said of the human rights movement and the TJ movement. So I think that the current challenges include, we'll get into this, I think it's interpersonal challenges of how we do our human rights work, organizational challenges of how we build, and here I'm talking, because it's where I come from, the Global North and international human rights organizations in the Global North need to continue to evolve, and then broader structural changes within the human rights movement itself. So, looking to get into more of those details, but I will stop there.
But nevertheless, I think there is much more you can tell us, because when listening to you, I think this very nicely leads us to our next question for this conversation, which is the role of Imaginaries, both in human rights and in DJ, for the cause of these challenges, but also for a solution to these challenges. So how can this idea of Imaginaries provide a useful entry point for us to move further? Could you please elaborate on this concept which you have been working on in the past years?
Didn't that seem like a natural segue? Yeah, exactly, that we planned it, because I wrote this anyways. Sure, I'd love to say something about it. And maybe first to say, I came to the concept of human rights imaginaries through transitional justice. And actually with Tina and Hugo and probably some others who I'm forgetting were in the room. Back in 2017, we did no, Hugo wasn't in the room, but you were in my head. You should have been in the room. We did a workshop on North-South dynamics within transitional justice. And the idea was what? You were running up. You were like running up in the hills. Don't mess with my jet lag. It's not fair. Too easily tripped up. So the conceit of that workshop was to address why are all the researchers predominantly based in the global north, and the research subjects and interventions in the global south, and what's driving that. And we had a productive workshop, and we published the proceedings of it, but I kept a preoccupation with that, and sort of why is it? Why do we fall into these patterns even as we think we know better, even as we try and anticipate the ways in which we are falling into patterns that reproduce hierarchies? And so I came to an understanding that the hierarchies that we end up reproducing in our work come and stem from what I call the International Human Rights Imaginary, which consists of both the ideas, central ideas about what human rights are, and the ways that are accepted to defend them. And that together, those ideas and practices constitute a world which we have constructed, and a shared sense of understanding. It's why you came to this conference and you didn't go to another conference, right? Because human rights, we all have a shared outer boundary. It doesn't mean these aren't contested, and in fact it would be quite boring if it were static. It's not. But it's what allows us to be in a social space together with a common vocabulary. And I argue that there are 5 kind of principles that underlie the imaginary, and which have far-reaching implications. And that the imaginary grew up, and so I'm going to use Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International because those are the hegemonic human rights organizations that they're too big to fail. They have an outsized role, both, I would say largely positive, but not unproblematic in the human rights movement. And the rest of us practice in their shadow. And some may be growing, some may be challenging these dominant paradigms, but if you want to sort of get a picture of what I'm talking about, I think, and the fact that there's so many heads nodding, that is the imaginary. If you recognize what I'm talking about, that is the power of imaginary. You're like, oh right, okay, I know what it is. So the principle, one, the human rights are universal. The idea of universality is central to the human rights paradigm. And I'm not the first person to say this, right? Mikhail Matua, lots of other critical scholars have said, right, it poses itself as universal and neutral, but it is based on Western vision of liberal, rooted in Western liberal thought. Now, because it's universal, that justifies action to defend those principles from anyone, anywhere. But what that has largely meant in terms of how this movement grew was that it justified essentially white Northern Europeans at Amnesty to intervene on behalf of prisoners of conscience around the world. That the idea of universality was the passport for transnational activism. Right? And relatedly, that it prioritizes civil and political rights. So it's not that the universal, but Amnesty didn't start working on all of the rights in the Universal Declaration until quite late in its history. Human Rights Watch even later in its history. So this idea then about human rights embeds in itself a hierarchy that civil and political rights are the important ones, economic and social rights are deprioritized. That's a hierarchy. It requires human rights also to defend human rights, requires objectivity and neutrality in order to be credible. And there is nothing more important to human rights advocacy than credibility. Because credibility is what is needed to persuade states to change their behavior. Right? So we've normalized a particular standard to which we hold ourselves. And because objectivity and neutrality are so important, that the final principle is that human rights defense requires expertise. And we've seen growth in the human rights movement, a growth towards professionalization, and an idea that special skills and knowledge are required to be the best human rights advocate. Now, when I say that these are the principles, it's not, there are other principles, and there are contradictions among these principles, right? And so, and we can talk about how those show up. But to understand why, which is my interest, why do we recreate hierarchies as we do this thing that we call human rights? It's because we have this operating system in the background that either directs us or we think that we're arguing against it. And so the erasure happens not because we intend to oppress the people that we think we're in collaboration with, but because we are just doing human rights work, right? It might conflict with our other principles, but it directs our attention to certain problems and away from others. That's invisibilization. It also tells us that, but we think we know the right way to do it. Right? Not that we can't be persuaded off of it, but that we can, with our principles, discern what the right way is to do. So the last thing I want to say is that it also justifies, the human rights imaginary then justifies the extractive practices that have been associated with North-based NGOs, right? Because we from the North need to go somewhere else, generally the global South, and quote unquote find the facts, verify the facts, and then translate those, because we will be the trusted intermediaries up to the global North, to international institutions, to quote unquote give voice to the victims. Now, of course, as we talked about, victims already have a voice, right? We're not giving them a voice, but you could trace the discourse from giving voice to amplification to opening space, right? So Rosalina came and spoke to us in her own voice. 15 years ago, she would not have. We would have had a North-based researcher quoting some derivative of a conversation that they had had with her in this space. And I think that's real progress. But we have a legacy, right? The imaginary is a deep-seated legacy against which we are now trying to reckon. So I think that the imaginary then helps us to see the need for those of us in the global north to re-examine our priorities and how the imaginary shows up and how it gets in the way, despite our best intention. We need to rethink what does solidarity look like, and are there hidden taxes that we are exacting from our South-based partners when we think we're acting in solidarity? And how can we open space to make way for more sustainable global human rights movement?
Thank you, Laurel. It's very interesting to see how this relationship between knowledge and power is just underpinning a lot of, it's coming up everywhere, right? So, Tine, would you like to reflect on the similarities or differences that you identify in the DJ Imaginaries?
Thank you. I would. Maybe I'll just start by referring to what to me was a very interesting difference in terms of the terminology that Laurel and I use. Because as you pointed out, Giselle, in her introduction, a lot of this work by Laurel on Imaginaries is in this 2023 article of the Journal of Human Rights Practice. And I'll lift the veil, Laurel. I was actually the handling editor for that article. So when I first saw that article, my first thinking was, oh darn, we have gotten it all wrong, because 2 years prior to that, me and my colleague Brigitte Heremans had done an article on the justice imagination. And then I read your article on Imaginaries, and I thought, oh darn, should we have used Imaginaries? This is just another case of, non-native speakers trying to do something, along these lines. So, and then I started thinking more about it. Why do you use the term Imaginaries and we use the term imagination? And I think it actually, they're very complementary in a way, I think. For us, the notion of the justice imagination was rooted in the scholarship also, for example, Lindsay Stonebridge, who writes eloquently on the judicial imagination, who also writes eloquently on this notion of giving voice, and please don't go and tell me that we give voice to victims. So it was very much rooted in that tradition. And for me, what was very important is that when you speak of imaginaries, it's so interesting how you're trying to unpack the power dynamics beyond or behind what is mainstream, behind what is something which is, as you said, not rigid, which is alterable in a way, but it is really stable. Whereas when we talked about imagination and the justice imagination, it was precisely about that contestation and about the contestation of what we call the outer boundaries of what is imaginable and what is thinkable. And so I think in a way that concept was coming more from an interest in or research on resistance and contestation. Also, I think very much rooted in research which flirts with and focuses on and is very interested in artistic practices, because I do think that these artistic practices are really something, as Gerardo Salinas also mentioned in his opening talk, that can allow us to think beyond those outer boundaries of the relatively stable paradigms. These artistic practices are something that can help us to find these little bubbles of oxygen, as he called it in his speech, where that contestation, these little pockets where that contestation is possible. So in that sense, I think the two concepts are very complementary. I think it's very much the case that also within DJ, these imaginaries obviously are at play. But I'm also really interested in this imagination, this capacity of envisioning maybe hypothetical alternative scenarios, what the arts can do in that sense, but also what indeed bringing other voices which have not been part of that mainstream imaginary into the conversation, like the voice of Sadina, but so many of the voices that we have heard here in the past days or hours, as I just realized. But that I think actually also speaks to a very important thing, which I also hinted at on the opening night. I think one imaginary is definitely kind of the mainstream formal institutional imaginary, which definitely, which has a lot of perspectives out of the debate, very much so. but I've also been increasingly concerned with some of the discourse of critical DJ scholarship and the risk inherent in us reproducing some of that erasure that is happening in mainstream imaginary. By which I mean that I've just been wondering so much, what happens when we fail to acknowledge the disruptive roots of transitional justice, when we fail to acknowledge that transitional justice arose in the streets of Latin America, not on 42nd Street in New York. DJ does not coincide with the formal institutions of transitional justice. And so I feel that often when we write as critical DJ scholars, we have a tendency of implicitly equating transitional justice with the institutions of transitional justice, and that's not what it is. I don't think it is, and I think we risk falling into the same trap if we equate it with that. Because if we fail to recognize the grassroots struggles for justice for what they are, which is actual drivers of the field and not just responses to or not just contestation of, but the actual thing, then our understanding of TJ completely flips and it becomes a very different thing. And of course, then still there would be, a sense of crisis. We now all have the sense that, the field of TJ is in crisis. But I think if we look at that practice, at that rapidly expanding practice, there is actually some reason for optimism as well. I also think that we have to do it, because not doing that, not looking at that grassroots activism as the thing that is TJ, it doesn't only erase or invisibilize the actions of people in global south, but also pockets in the global north very much. If you look at Africa down Alabama, what's happening there, like this is global north, but but when we don't in our critical scholarship significant or sufficiently acknowledge that, I think we're also doing what you pointed out, we discussed with the workshop in 2017, we're invisibilizing those power relations, global north, global south, and how we are constantly reproducing that. So that to me has been very important to look at. I also, for example, our colleague Stephen Jensen is also doing a similar exercise for the human rights movement in general, how that also has, roots in Latin America, for example, to bring these struggles back to the front and the center of the debate. And I think that is important because it tells us something about the essence of our practice and where it can go, what human rights or transitional justice are, what they can do, what they should do. And it's true that for us, we are very much looking at aparadigmatic cases of transitional justice to get a better understanding of that, of this disruption, of this resistance, because in our project what we've been observing is that it's very much the case that when we see TJ being mobilized in these so-called aparadigmatic cases, so not kind of the textbook transitions, but context of colonial, decolonial struggles, of TJ and ongoing violence, what we see there is that the interest of people isn't, or the interest of justice actors isn't typically in the formal institutions of TJ. Obviously it's not. It's exactly in that disruptive power of TJs, and let that be the thing which was kind of at the essence of the early TJ struggles as well. So that looking at that history and tracing back that history, that history of disruption, I think is very important. It very much speaks also, obviously, to transformative justice scholarship. I mean, I think the proposals, I don't know if Paul is already in the room, but like of transformative justice scholars, they've shaped us a lot, and I think a lot of us are actually operating in a more kind of transformative understanding of TJ. I think the added layer of also looking at kind of story of origin of TJ and how disruption is a fundamental part of that also helps us to see that temporal continuity that was there from the start. It's not just, for example, transformation, disruption. It's not just something that the people that we talk to today are often asking. It's also something which has been there from the start. And so why didn't that, for example, make it into the imaginary, right? Why didn't that become part of the mainstream imaginary? And I think if we look at those roots and if we look at how we acted upon, or how we sought to take forward the demands, and by we, I'm referring, for example, to myself as a global North scholar, but also at an institutional level. I think we can learn a lot of how to try to do it better this time. Now that we see all this teaching happening in gay paradigmatic cases, how are we trying to capture its essence in ways that don't lead us to fall in the same kind, solution thinking or the kinds of solutions that we have already tried in the past. So that is one part of it. I also think it's quite interesting to think about positive examples, and for example, to also stay with which we've talked a bit about Guatemala in various plenaries and in various panels also, and I think there what you see is quite inspirational in terms of how much there has been kind of an interesting collaboration between indigenous activists and academics, whereby forces reinforce each other, where there has been relentless activism of indigenous activists, which made it impossible for academia to not engage with that, which brought these voices more to the center of the debate in academia, etc. And so I think there are ways in which we can think about how we make sure that we try to contest these imaginaries by looking more at how we can open the justice imagination through these various voices.
Thank you, Tina. Yes, but just briefly before opening the floor for Q&A, Laurel, I would like to ask you, which entry points do you see to reimagine the human rights imaginaries? If you could just briefly say, where do you see these, promising avenues at the human rights imaginary level?
I'm going to gesture to it kind of in the opening. I think that we do see these contestations. So I think climate justice and youth activism are hugely disruptive in positive ways. It's sort of exploding this notion of, we don't care what the international law and norms is. The planet is burning and you've got to stop it, so stop it, right? And I think that just kind of makes us all kind of pull up short and you got a point. What will it take? I think that's a paradigm. I think it's a paradigm shift. I think all of these external shocks to humanity, right? These are all existential crises. And those social movements that are mobilizing around them, I think, are disruptive. So that's on the external. On the internal, I think that the possibilities for transformation, I said, one interpersonally, I think that the movement post George Floyd to become anti-racist institutions in the global north. I'm not saying that that work shouldn't also happen or need to happen in the global south, but I'm speaking from my own position and not for others. So that's started and ongoing, and I think will need to deepen. I think organizationally, you're seeing a move from INGOs based in the global north to global INGOs, and whether or not that's south washing or not, I think that's going to happen over time. You're seeing diversification of the boards. You're seeing increased representation at the staff level in traditional INGOs from those from the global south. That's going to help. And then I think strategically organizations are asking and have to ask, so what is our value add, right? What is it that we're doing that is helping to open up space and to strengthen a global human rights movement, and not assume that it's doing what we always do because we're so good at it, that must be what we need to continue doing. So I think that those would be, just as a sketch, some places to start.
Thank you so much, Laurel. Well, it's time for questions from the audience. I see many hands. Let me start in the front. Yes, I think.
Thank you very much for your reflections. I think they were very important. I have only 2 or 3 ideas that to share with you. First of all, when we talk about transitional justice, we talk about justice through reparation, but I didn't hear anything or not that much about non-repetition warranties. So, how to deal with the transitional justice and where are the non-repetition, because as I see, the repetition is over and over and over. The second thing that is important, that is a challenge as well, that sometimes we see transitional justice process like a capsule, that we are talking about human rights violation is conflict, but the situation like in Guatemala or Salvador or Peru is like the life goes on and the crisis in human rights is still on. So we have like victims from the conflict, but the whole situation is very bad as well. So how to deal with this? And the other thing is that what about the Caribbean? What about Haiti? Because I didn't hear anything coming from the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. We work with all the Central America, South America, North America, and the Caribbean. So what is happening in Haiti is more than a genocide. It's like a war. What's happening in all the countries of the Caribbean, with the COVID and everything, Because when we talk about racial discrimination and that, as my experience, when we talk with people from the Caribbean, they feel the same. They're totally invisible in the world. So that's some ideas about that. And the other thing is how important is to be in this conference as well. But how important it would be that next time in another conference to have the victims directly. Not only people who are talking for the victims, that I investigate that and did that, but what's going on with the people in the field, and especially in the case of women or girls or indigenous in general, but directly talking about it.
Thank you very much. I'm Bene from the Philippines. I actually wanted to ask, because one of the things that I have observed in the Philippines is that the human rights advocates or defenders are coming from only one generation, and that was the past generation. And it has not passed through the younger generation that you're actually talking about. They did not have, the current generation do not have a moment wherein they would actually put all of their strength together in order to go to the streets, etc. They have other priorities, so that's one. Second is if they do try to actually make critiques of government, there is a constitutional mandate about human rights, one of the longest in any constitution around the world. However, the current laws, for example, dictates that national security is actually paramount. So therefore, those human rights advocates or defenders or activists are red tagged, are called communists. And in that sense, you have 2 things. First is that the younger generations do not prioritize human rights. Second, they do try to prioritize human rights, but they are actually at risk of doing so. Thank you.
Maybe I'll start with the first question, which I think is really interesting about non-repetition. And I think you're very right. I think the whole paradigm and the logic of non-repetition is very much rooted in this paradigmatic idea of DJ, violent past, moment of rupture, peaceful future. So how are we now going to ensure that in this peaceful future, we're not going to have this slide back to a violent past? And I think increasingly what we're seeing with the new context in which DJ is implemented is we're not talking about non-repetition at all. We're talking about ongoingness. There is ongoingness of violence. There is ongoingness of racist violence, of other kinds of structural and systemic factors that continue structural violence, but also in some cases direct violence. So for me, the vocabulary of non-repetition is increasingly inadequate to capture that which people are expecting of transitional justice. I was talking about this with Vinny over breakfast. We had this book, I think, last year or 2 years ago on aparadigmatic DJ, where we tried to reshuffle a bit what the parameters or the normative objectives of DJ are, not formulating them along the 4 or 5 pillars of DJ, but thinking about what is it that people are demanding of DJ. And I think accountability is still a very important one. I think repair, and I really liked Nicole's intervention yesterday, repair rather than reparations. Repair is still a very important one, and I think disruption is an important one because we are talking not just in aparadigmatic cases, but also in paradigmatic cases about ongoingness. Lots of ongoingness rather than non-repetition. And so these three, for me, in terms of capturing both backward-looking and forward-looking, are a more generative way of thinking about what TJ can and cannot do. And I think it actually also goes to your other point about TJ as a capsule, and that just kind of enters, and in a way that speaks to Vinny's point about how do we get young people to mobilize. I think it is by thinking about TJ as an ecosystem of different kinds of struggles, and it also goes to the point that Laurel was making, you know, the climate justice movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, they're all struggles that can speak to each other, that can reinforce each other, and I think we have to probably move away from this idea that TJ is that very clearly defined thing, and it is part of an ecosystem, which could be a way of hoping to understand better, not just that TJ is not a capsule, but also how it can involve other struggles, also as part of the struggle for justice, historical justice, etc. No violence.
I think we'll take the. Thank you so much for the intervention on the Philippines, because I think that I can't speak to that particular context. I haven't worked on that directly, and your lived experience is more important than anything I have to say. I will say, though, that in general, this problem that you identified, I think is more, it is widespread, and the criminalization of human rights defenders is a global phenomenon, and if we don't have human rights defenders, we don't have a human rights movement. And the way in which you describe how it's maybe deterring or pushing out the next generation of activists is exactly the intended effect of criminalizing human rights defenders, is to quash the movement. That's one of the problems that I've also been thinking about, and thinking about it in the context of the traditional tools that the human rights imaginary gives us, and say, well, then we need to document it, we need to go to Geneva, we need to have new norms, we need to have better enforcement, we need to, so I'm thinking, okay, what are new ways that we could do this? And how do we build support? Like the traditional paradigm is you have an activist base that is trying to pressure elites, opinion leaders, decision makers, political leaders. And the human rights movement has not done a lot, or nearly enough, to build support in the middle, right? And build popular support. We thought, well, that's not what we do. We do the norms and the enforcement, and that is someone else. That's a social movement. And yet, where social movements are subject to the same shrinking because of the same dynamics that are at play for human rights defenders, then you don't have social movements. So what can we do? One of the ideas that I'm working on is how can we build tools that can use new technologies, because that's how young people and increasingly older people get their information, to build support for human rights causes and human rights values. Because so that the stigmatization that sticks socially, politically, legally in increasingly closed societies sticks because because there isn't a counter narrative. There isn't enough popular support. So how can we build that popular support so that it is not seen as legitimate when human rights defenders are called out as threats to national security? So I think those are some of the ideas, like that we need to be thinking and building new tools and new ways of communicating and new targets of audience to create we need to change the ecosystem within which human rights activism takes place.
Thank you, Laurel. And I think this resonates very much with the need to build new narratives, positive narratives about human rights that can circulate through mediums that are now dominated by negative narratives of human rights, right? Are there burning questions from the audience? Yes. One last question and then we go to break.
Thank you both for the enlightening conversations. For me, just picking up on the points you both said, especially when we're thinking about, this imaginary, as you call it, of TJ, being a capsule or just having a temporary dimension in a way, and how can we rethink about building this when the funding itself of, the programmatic nature of TJ, when we're talking about justice programs are so temporary and there's a particular funding in a context, and then the priorities of donors of international organization changes, but the realities on the ground remain the same. And this is something that maybe draws from my research in Guatemala, in which the UN pushed for a lot of transitional justice programs, in the framework of the UNDP that lasted for 10, 15 years. And what's going on is that the funding is no longer there. And civil society victims, especially I noticed it in the framework of the pandemic, they did not have enough support internationally to continue carrying on struggles for accountability, for reparations. So this speaks to me a lot about how to rethink, as you said, and how to build new tools, how to build sustainability as well of these movements when there is, a surge of international funding in a particular context, but that funding at some point in time will be gone. And how do we continue this carrying as well the consequences on the ground for civil society and victims that sometimes do not feel that support anymore, and that also plays a part in how this will develop over time. And so I think when we think about ongoingness of violence, we need to rethink about how are we supporting internationally as well, and the funding scheme in itself or structure is something that we need to maybe rethink, and the imaginary might be something that we can think as well in terms of funding. But something that maybe I would like to ask you more about these particular schemes of how do we fund TJ, what are the dynamics that are going above, and how they replicate when, in paradigmatic cases 20 years happen and things are still problematic.
There's one question here.
Thank you for your presentation. It's very interesting. I'm not very fan of this North-South debate. The world is already divided, and then we are divided, and then also in your terms, the global South is still victimizing from the global North, and then it's a division due to power and resource dynamics. So, in this debate, where do you put China or other emerging power in this debate? That is another dynamics, and I think this is the end of global transitional justice era from the victims' lens. The victims and survivors in the ground, they are completely detached from this debate and knowledge production. And you also mentioned about the post-transitional justice debate. How do you envision post-TJ and for the victims and survivors in the global South?
Thank you for, really thought-provoking presentations. I'm just wondering whether we need to think about like a global movement against impunity, because what you said, Lauren, about credibility. The way the human rights system is working at the moment is that, at least in the global South, and I'm talking from the experience of Sri Lanka, we have depended on certain actors in the global North. In particular, the US, the EU, and the USA, to put pressure on the Sri Lankan state, right? In a context where they have allied with, say, China and Russia, where they can ignore human rights and depend on support from these countries. But what I now live in Belfast, and what I'm finding is that the UK is not even interested in upholding justice in the UK. With the Legacy Act, for instance, they want to entrench impunity for certain crimes committed by the British Army in Northern Ireland. So then, I mean, how can they defend human rights? You know, how can they uphold or put pressure on the Sri Lankan state anymore? And also what's happening in Gaza. So it seems like at the moment, you know, the focus is on human rights violations in the global south. I wonder whether there's an equally strong movement to put pressure on states in the global north, because if there are no longer credible actors to uphold human rights, like we are all going to fail. Like victim survivors all around the world are going to fall through the cracks. And we really need to address the double standards, the hypocrisy, you know, the selectivity. Yeah.
May I quickly add something onto that? Also from the Sri Lankan experience, and thank you again for the very interesting presentations. Did either of you find the concept of coloniality, i.e. the underlying logic of colonialism, remaining in our lives, in our practices, epistemically, ontologically, useful in the framings that you did, particularly on, in what you were saying, you were sort of suggesting it, Laurel, but I'm wondering why you perhaps chose not to enter into that language, or was there a decision to do so? Thank you.
I know we're standing between you and beverages. So I thank you all for these interventions. I'm not going anywhere. I'm here all day, so I would love to have multilateral, bilateral conversations. There are just the limits of time and space. These are all really rich questions. There's an inevitable reduction in what I can present and the vocabulary, and I invite further conversation to deepen these. And the entire human rights and Chinjay movements are riddled with contradictions. These questions here get at many of them, and those are the challenges that we face, is how do we work within a world of contradictions to build the world that we want to live in.
I'm just going to echo Laurel's thanks for those remarks, and I think we knew from the start when we organized this conference that it was going to be a conversation starter more than us giving answers, etc. And I think all these questions are really helping us to shape our own thinking. So thank you so much for that. I hope that we can take them forward, not just today, the questions and informal conversations, but that we can also stay in touch, because I know that we keep promising you that there will be more time for Q&A on the opening night and yesterday and today, but we'll have time for coffee. So thank you so much.
And I would like to thank you for your very clear presentations and reflections. Thank you for the excellent questions from the audience. I'd like to invite you now for the break, and thank you everybody.